Introducing the new DigiCert. As the leading provider of high-assurance SSL, TLS, and PKI certificates, DigiCert is all about improving security across the web and IoT. DigiCert is committed to helping customers and partners successfully deploy identity, authentication, and encryption solutions. They'll even help you figure out which certificate you need to secure your web domains, apps, devices, and more. Check out the Cert Wizard tool under the SSL tab on digicert.com. The average time between being hacked and realizing you've been hacked is 1 year. Can you afford to let an intruder roam your network for that long? Can your company weather the fallout when this comes to light? Black Hills Information Security can find the bad guys in your network and train you to do it yourself. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a hunt teaming engagement can help you find a persistent threat in your network. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW. Welcome back, everyone, to Pulse Security Weekly. This is our segment on RSA. I want to remind everyone to go to itpro.tv/securityweekly. First, of course, check out our fine friends at IT Pro TV. Over 3,300 hours of training. Go check them out. Alrighty. Jeff, I hope your excuse me, assessment of RSA is better than story number 1 in that section, because I love Anton. Anton's been a friend for a long time.
Anton.
Didn't know what quite was going on in that article, to be honest with you.
My assessment of RSA will be what it is.
And I wouldn't expect anything less.
Or more.
Or more.
Or more. So, we talked a couple of weeks ago with Ron Gula about, pre-RSA and how to approach RSA. If you didn't listen to that, it's too late now because it came and went. But, RSA is really there's several different things going on. Some are intentional and some are just sort of organic. Probably the first thing I should mention is huge props to BSides San Francisco, because they moved venues this year, whereas in years past they've been like a mile and a quarter away from Moscone Center, which is where RSA happens. Great venue. Love the venue where BSides used to be, but this year they moved it to like right smack in the middle of Moscone Center in the I don't know how you say it, Yerba Buena Gardens. There's an IMAX theater right there, and that's where they held BSides. So it's like BSides San Francisco, merged or morphed or became very much a part of RSA, and I think that was a huge success. I haven't heard anybody other than saying the venue was different, but they had lots of room, everything was spread out, they had lots of vendors there, and from what I heard, everybody had a good time. And I did get a small amount of time to stop in on BSides and check that out. But RSA, I think a lot of what we talk about at RSA is walking the vendor floor, the expo area, which is not one but 2 convention center halls, huge, hundreds and hundreds of vendors that are in there, and it's there's the large companies that spend hundreds, if not millions of dollars on their booths. And they're double decker and they're futuristic, and you can go upstairs and have private meetings and all sorts of cool stuff. And then there's the smaller companies, the startups, the leaner companies that are typically on the fringe. They're out on the edges. That one poor company I saw, they had like a putting green, so you could come up and you could play, putt a golf ball. And I noticed they had it off to one side that I couldn't do it because I was left-handed because I was up against the wall. Won't say who they were, but the contrast between companies that can barely afford to get a 10 by 10 booth and have a presence versus the large companies that just blow the doors off of booths year in and year out. So there's almost like this subculture of competition on who's got the coolest booth, yet alone who's coming up with the best marketing messaging, and I'll double back on that in a minute. There's also, I think, a fair amount of companies that have figured out the way to do RSA is not to necessarily be in the vendor area, but do something. Be at RSA, be in San Francisco, rent out a nearby restaurant or a nearby club, and have a customer appreciation party, have an open house, have a breakfast, have a lunch, have a dinner, have a happy hour. I did a couple of whiskey cigar tasting type parties with companies, and they tend to be smaller and more intimate. You have more of an opportunity to actually talk to the company that's there and talk to people that you meet, and you can actually hear them. There's of course the big parties that companies will bring in bands and rent out entire places, and they're crazy. So there's that element of sort of the off-site stuff. There's also, of course, the talks, which I didn't get to go to any of because I was too busy running around trying to meet vendors and see what was going on. And I've heard very little about the content of the messages. I would run into people that said, "Oh, I was, the keynote today was really good," that type of thing. I think technically I can go back and listen to the recordings of many of the talks. I still want to do that, but so. Going into RSA, there's a lot of different things to cover, and you really, it's almost like Disney World. You can't really take it all in a couple of days. There's just so much to see. There was chatter on Twitter before RSA. People were asking, what they thought was going to be the theme of the year. It seems like every year, for some strange reason, all these different companies end up having very similar messaging, at their booths and what their talking points are. And the speculation going in, and I to some degree, it didn't disappoint. AI and machine learning was one of the hot topics. There was I'm not even sure if it boils down to one sort of theme, but there was sort of an ongoing many variations of endpoint, what I would just collectively call endpoint protection, new ways of doing it, new automation, at least new messaging about the way companies approach doing endpoint protection in terms of malware discovery and how well they do it.
Wait,
and how
is
much
it
better
discovery?
They do it.
Is it discovery, or is it detection, or is it prevention, or is it reaction?
Yes.
So I've ended up just calling it endpoint security.
Endpoint security. Fair enough.
Because anytime I say anything different,
with what to call it.
Anytime I've said anything different, people are like, "Oh, well, we're a protection company on the endpoint, not necessarily in detection, or we're detection and in reaction, not prevention." So I just call it endpoint security.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to sum it up. And what was interesting, I've been going to RSA for not as many years as probably people think, only since I started at Tenable. So I think this was my 5th RSA. But I've been going to tech conferences like this for over 30 years. And at some point, everything kind of blurs together. It's like when you see your class picture from elementary school and you see your friends, and if you kind of squint, it's like the same picture. The people are different, the faces are different, but the clothes are the same, and you're still standing behind the same, in front of the same curtain, and it doesn't matter what year it is. So they all kind of blur together, and I think Keith Hoodlet, I don't know if you've had a chance to talk to him. I think he summed it up really well. I was talking to him during the week, and if you know Keith, he's a pretty energetic, enthusiastic guy that loves his craft, is passionate about web applications and web application security and all the technology that's out there and everything. And what he said was, which I thought was very interesting, was, and I'm sorry to steal his thunder. He's probably going to talk about it on his show. But he said this is the first year he felt like he wasn't a kid in the candy shop. Like there wasn't really anything new or different out there. Like he'd seen it all before. And I certainly had that feeling too. There was very, very few vendors that I talked to, not saying they weren't out there, but there was very few vendors that I talked to, because I stuck to the big main halls, that, they had what they sold. They are what they are, and it was much more repackaging the messaging, refocusing the messaging on what are perceived to be the current trends. Things like endpoint security comes into play again, obviously, dealing with malware. The whole idea of what are you doing in the cloud security is a generic thing. DevOps came up in some more in discussions, not so much like there's products out there. That was more discussions we had. IoT was a big deal. Oh, and I forgot to mention, so there's a part of RSA that features sort of new companies, up and coming companies, startups, and they call that the innovation sandbox. And that's where most of the people that we know from kind of the hacker community were hanging out, because that's where it's fresh, and that's where it's new, and that's where it's different. And I unfortunately didn't have much time to go and check out the innovation sandbox. But one of the reasons why I didn't mind that I wasn't there a whole lot was because it was sort of our echo chamber. I was most familiar with the people there. And the focus there seemed to be IoT, and there were a lot of different demonstrations of the impact of breaking in or doing something nefarious to IoT devices, as well as industrial control systems, ICS security. That seemed to be the theme at the Innovation Sandbox. I think it was Josh Corman. I want to say it was the Cavalry. I apologize if I was wrong, but they actually did sort of a mock medical incident where they had somebody up on stage that supposedly had like a pacemaker in, get the thing hacked and have a medical incident. And so they brought like the stretcher up, medical personnel, and tended to the person right on stage, kind of as a live demo. That seemed to be pretty poignant, and people seem to talk about that a lot. So props to them for raising the awareness of making all this hypothetical stuff that we sometimes talk about, theoretical stuff that we talk about, real, and showing people, well, this is what we're talking about.
Did they do any surgery on stage? That would have been awesome.
I don't think they did the surgery, but they certainly had the men in the white coats up there with the stretchers and everything. I don't know if they had paddles or whatever, and of course, hopefully, it was all an act. But one thing that I thought was interesting, and sort of infusing a little bit of my bias into it, was I've been sort of noodling over the last year and a half about, well, I've been thinking about this for a long time, about how in security there seems to be nothing new. We seem to keep recycling the same old stuff. Technology advances, new things are happening. We're in the cloud, we're in containers, there's everything's on mobile devices, but the fundamentals of security don't seem to have ever changed. And I was actually slightly encouraged, even though they sort of put marketing spin on it, but the recognition that it's not so much about protecting and the security of systems and networks. It's actually the data that you're dealing with and processing and storing on these systems and networks is, in fact, what we should be worried about. And of course, a lot of companies were presenting that as something new, and I think the buzzword for that I think goes right up to RSA itself was data transformation. Again, there's variations on a theme. One of the themes was something like identity is the new perimeter. So the idea that the perimeter is no longer what we think of as the traditional network corporate perimeter, but because we have personal devices, mobile devices, and we're doing work on them, the company data, the data that we care about, is walking around with people, all the employees that we have, which I think is I mean, for a lot of people, that's a new concept. For a lot of people, they're like, wow, we've never thought of that before. For me, it's like, wow, we're going back to the old days prior to cyber and prior to InfoSec, to what we used to call communication security, or even, data security. The idea that it's the data, it's the information that needs to be protected. And so I had conversations with several companies talking about I think what they call it is data portability. The idea of, you've got sensitive data and you want to share it with your coworkers, you want to send it to somebody, and the idea that the data moves, but you encrypt it, and you encrypt it in such a way that only certain people can decrypt it, or you can only share it with certain people, even though it's moving around. So, the data could be in the cloud, the data could be transferred, emailed, texted, whatever, to somebody else's device. And even if it's stolen, you have to be a certain person, you have to have the right things to be able to, and maybe for a certain period of time, you have this limited window, if you're the authorized person, to be able to open up the data and have access to it, which I keep thinking that's what we used to do 30, 35 years ago, not on computers and networks necessarily, but the idea that data has a life expectancy, that data has a value, and it's not just secure everything. It's, no, this data is important. Let's say it's a merger and acquisition data. That data is extremely sensitive to the companies involved in the M&A, but sometime after the M&A happens or doesn't happen, it's not necessarily that critical anymore. Or, you're rolling out a new product, so you've got R&D data that you need to protect until you get it published, or until you get the patents, until you take the product to market. But after that, maybe it's not that critical. Or, payment card data. How long is a credit card good for? A couple years. But in the PCI world, everybody always treated the transaction data as accounting data. And so they would save it for 7 years and then a few more years just in case. But, how many people are walking around with a credit card that doesn't expire for 7 years? The expiration dates are getting longer these days. I think I've got a card that's good till 2020. But typically, credit cards are only good for a couple years. Why are you keeping transaction data for 7 or 10 years? Maybe you don't need to. And as long as you're keeping it, you need to protect it, you need to secure it, you need to encrypt it, and so on and so on. So I was actually encouraged a little bit, and I'm not one that's easily encouraged by much in this business, but the idea that whether they know it or not, where I want to see the industry go, where I want to see us go, is maybe going back to the basics and understanding the basics of data security, and that seems to be happening a little bit, whether they know it or not, in terms of all these new things like data portability or data transformation, and even the acknowledgement that extends into the cloud and cloud security. I heard a lot of people say, well, the cloud is just somebody else's server rack. And I'm like, well, yeah, I've seen that. I've been to colo centers. The cloud's been around for quite a long time. It just hasn't been a marketing thing. And of course, I think a lot of the popularity of the cloud these days is virtualization and the way that's happening, where even in our previous segment we were talking about the need to test something and to bring up either a test environment or not something other than the production environment. And I'm just thinking 15, 20 years ago, that would take weeks, if not months, to stage a separate environment. Yep. But nowadays it can be done in mere minutes, if not seconds. Yeah. So I'll pause a minute for questions, thoughts, pushback.
It sounds like that if you're going to RSA next year, you should go to BSides, San Francisco.
Especially if they stay in that location.
Yep. Definitely get a ticket to that, or if you're a sponsor that conference. Because it sounds like it's right, in the thick of things. And then get, for us, my thought was it sounds like the Innovation Sandbox is a great place to hang out. So you got to get some kind of expo or bless you, press pass to get you into that area. Yep. Which is not an easy thing to do in major conferences. In case you're wondering, listeners out there, we have to actually provide evidence that we produce content, we have to actually send them more shows and say, yes, Paul is on a show, Jeff is on a show. You do work for a media company, and they don't just believe you, like they actually check to make sure you are a content creator.
Correct.
To get that.
Correct. And in many cases, they ask for a business card.
Yep, business cards.
We have those. Yep.
Yeah, sometimes it's a business card, and Black Hat is similar, but at RSA, this is the second year I've been there, and full disclosure, I was there on behalf of Security Weekly, in case you hadn't figured that out yet. So I had a press pass, a media pass, and I actually was inundated with interview requests, which are very common for the people that are, people that are speaking or people that are, sort of luminaries in the business. They get put upon a lot. And similarly, because I had a press pass, they consider me to be a journalist or blogger or whatever. So, a lot of companies, through their PR firms were saying, hey, would you come talk to us? We're doing all this really cool stuff. So a lot of my exposure to what was going on at RSA came from interviewing, various folks at various companies that, reached out to me and it's like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I would kind of like to talk to them. Because I'm a crippy at heart, I tended to gravitate towards, from a technology perspective, the companies that were talking about various applications of cryptography. If they mentioned quantum cryptography, I kind of perked up and said, yeah, I want to talk to those guys. And I learned not only is quantum cryptography a looming problem, but it's that the buzzword is now post-quantum cryptography. So if you haven't figured out quantum cryptography yet, buckle your seatbelt because now there's post-quantum cryptography.
But I thought there were no quantum computers yet.
There aren't, but they're working on them, and they're projected to be able to have a functional. Of course, there's a debate on when the date is, but it's within the next 10 or 15 years. They're projecting to have quantum computers that, for the benefit of the audience, anyone listening, the issue with quantum cryptography or quantum computers is that there's this thing called the Shor's algorithm, which was published, I think, back in the early 90s, that basically breaks public key cryptography. And I'm a cryptographer, and I'm already misspeaking. The cryptography is not broken; it's solved. Mm-hmm. The brute force nature of solving the cryptography, and what makes public key cryptography secure is that they use very, very large prime numbers and kind of multiply them together, and the way to solve it or break it is to figure out what the prime factors are, and of these and I'm not a mathematician, but you have to factor these very, very large numbers, which is computationally very time consuming, but somehow quantum cryptography does it very, very quickly and very, very efficiently, which effectively renders public key cryptography useless. So where do we use public key cryptography primarily in this modern connected world? Mostly web traffic. The HTTPS, that's using not exclusively, but it's using public key cryptography. Public key cryptography is very often used to exchange keys that are then using a more traditional, what's known as a symmetric algorithm, which is where the key is the same on the decrypt and the encrypt side, and that's where you get the speed of the encryption and the decryption, which makes things like secure transactions, secure web traffic, even secure video streaming and that type of stuff feasible. So
now wait, but what is quantum cryptography then if there is no quantum computer?
It's the recognition that in a relatively short amount of time, public key cryptography, which so much of the internet is built on, like an SSL certificate, a TLS certificate, is essentially a public key in a public-private public key cryptography key scheme. So that's how pervasive it is, and it's rendered useless because it's very quickly solvable in the near future. Near future being in the next 15 years or so. And most of the scientists and physicists that are working on, are within 5 years or so of agreeing on when this all happens. So, 15 years, 20 years at the outside. So there is a need to, and NIST as an organization is sort of put out a call for people to come up with new algorithms to replace public key cryptography. And that's been going on for a while. And they have their submissions. And somebody was telling me that all the submissions are, somebody packed them all together and bundled them all together, and they're available for download somewhere, although I haven't looked for it yet. And but there's like 60 of them or something like that.
I gotcha. And have they chosen, and so are the vendors that were there, like in that running to actually have some of these newer algorithms available, and that's what they're promoting?
Yeah, a couple of them were. I talked to 2 or 3 or 4 of the crypto companies, and several of them had submitted several algorithms.
Right.
And so I was asking what post-quantum cryptography was, and you could argue it's the same as quantum cryptography, but it's essentially NIST is in the process of trying to approve new algorithms, new crypto algorithms for general use for various implementations, applications, but the review process they're projecting to take maybe 5 or 10 years. And so this one company I was talking to was saying, well, if it's going to take NIST 10 years to come up with an approved algorithm, and you've got data that you want to protect for 20 years, so you start off by protecting it using one of the traditional algorithms, either some of the classic like crypto algorithms that are symmetric, like AES, for example, that the key length might ultimately get broken, or you're using some form of public key cryptography like PGP. You're running out of time, and there's going to be this gap where your data is essentially unprotected because the old algorithm ran out and the new algorithms aren't there yet. So they're basically saying, what do you do in the meantime? And I was thinking back to, I think I've told the story on the air about, my early experience with Bruce Schneier and his applied cryptography book, where he says, encryption solves everything, and it never has. I said to this one company, I said, well, why don't we just give up on encryption? I mean, it's never worked. Why don't we just forget about it altogether? And they kind of freaked out. But my other solution was, the one unsolvable crypto system is the OneTime Pad, and of course that's not feasible because it's very, it doesn't work for streaming video or anything. But it's secure. So from my perspective, we have sacrificed security for speed and convenience and all the wonderful things we experience with the internet. But if you really wanted to secure your data, use a OneTime Pad.
So there's an article, I won't even say interesting. There was an article from eWeek that was published, and it says...
Are we moving to stories, or are we moving still on RSA?
I added this to the RSA section.
Okay, just checking.
So eWeek says the RSA Conference 2018 event was branded with a new theme, Now Matters. But does it actually matter? It all depends on who is speaking. Did you get that theme when you were there, Jeff, that... Now
that
matters?
was their branded theme. That was part of the whole, logo of the RSA conference this year. Although, one of the people that I had a chance to talk to was the president of RSA. I sat down and interviewed him, and he claimed to know what Security Weekly was, and I don't know whether he did or didn't. But I said, look, we're not really journalists. We're podcasters, and we drink a lot. So, I don't really want to have the party line, just give me your standard pitch. Let's just have a conversation. And to his credit, he went about 8 minutes before he dropped the first buzzword. We had a real conversation, and we were talking about, how RSA kind of has a reputation for the conference. It's been going on for, I don't know how, 20, 25 years. And, key fobs. We all used to have the little RSA key fobs, or many of us had them, the secure IDs. And I asked him, I said, well, so what does RSA do now? And he's like, well, that's the problem we have. We're trying to and I'm paraphrasing, but we're trying to reinvent RSA. We're trying to move into different areas. What of RSA is the RSA of the past, but we're looking to the future, and before the future is the present. And that's actually, I think, if there was anything, I think that's a theme that's emerging, or what I picked up on. And I look at things a little bit differently, perhaps, but I just saw a whole lot of companies there that I'd seen before. All the companies we know about, a lot of the people that we know from the marketing world that either are still at Tenable or have moved on to other places. Going through the whole exercise, and I'm not dissing them in any way. It's a lot of hard work trying to come up with, what sells, what's the new messaging, how do we get it just right. But it just seemed like everybody is just on this treadmill of, we have whatever technology we sell, we need to come up with a new creative way of pitching what we've been doing for the last X number of years. So I think a lot of companies are sort of staring down this barrel of, where do we go from here? Because there is nothing new and different. And I think it's interesting too, because I had several conversations with people, like GDPR. It was, we were talking beforehand, in the Twitterverse, whether GDPR would be a big topic, and it was, and it wasn't. Some of the crypto companies I talked to that were European based, I said, well, are you gearing up for GDPR? And they're like, no, why would we? That's privacy. That's not security. And I'm like, really? You don't think people are going to want to start securing their data in 2 months or whenever it is? And other companies were totally on top of it from the perspective of, oh, yeah, we're gearing up for it. We're going to make sure that we're talking about it. We've got our talking points, our user personas, our use cases, and all that kind of stuff. But given what we've talked about the last month or so with like the Zuckerberg hearing and what Facebook allegedly did, I had several conversations and was asking the question, what do you guys think? Because, A, what's the difference between security and privacy? Is there a difference? B, from a privacy perspective, sort of the classical approach where it's personal data, personally identifiable information, name, address, phone number, social security number, bank account number, credit card, debit card number. Now we're moving into this realm where it's not only that, but it's also our GPS coordinates, because we've always got a mobile device attached to us. It's our surfing habits, it's our browsing habits, it's our what apps do we use habits, and all the apps, how they, all that information that they're talking about on Facebook and other places about what's being collected. And in our previous segment, we were talking about how complex web applications are today because they're connected to the Facebooks and the Googles, and all this cookie information is flying around. I feel like, and I'd be interested in your guys' perspective, I kind of feel like we're getting to sort of this day of reckoning where we haven't really, as an industry or maybe even a society, figured out how to deal with all this new type of data that goes beyond the traditional, what we think of as personal data, or even, from a corporate perspective, sensitive data. And not only that, but it's no longer the bad guys, the threats that are looking to steal for political purposes or to commit espionage, to get a leg up in whatever Cold War we're involved with, or simply, from a monetary perspective, can they steal stuff that they can sell? Now it's not necessarily a matter of stealing data. It's a matter of influencing people's perceptions. It's about this whole fake news thing that we hear about all the time and sort of don't really talk about. I feel like as an industry, if not a society, we are wholly unequipped to tackle this and figure out how to do it. And ironically, my last thought, and I'll let you guys comment, in our industry where we pretty regularly hold hold at arm's length any kind of regulatory government intervention. We think of the government as the big brother. We want to be left alone. We don't want the protections. I think it's ironic that when we're looking to things like IoT security, when we're looking at things like, what happened with Facebook, and everybody seems to be falling down to the government needs to do something. We need to regulate. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I just think it's kind of ironic that those of us that very often say we don't like regulation, we want to be left alone, freedom and liberty. But when push comes to shove, we're like, wow, seems like there's no other way to solve the problem except for to have the government step in.
Or
I'll shut up.
I'll shut up. I think WAFs solve a huge problem.
We can just put WAF in front
and blockchains. Blockchains solve.
But you know what? You need to run your WAF in the blockchain.
That's right. That's what I'm going with.
So you went from the beer to the stuff you smoke, huh?
WAFs and blockchains.
WAFs and blockchain.
Mm-hmm. WAFs and blockchains.
I'll drink to that.
Anton says some interesting things about blockchains in his article. I guess it's an article.
I missed this article, and I think I'm probably glad that I did.
I respect Anton enough that I'm not going to read his article.
Yeah, I don't read it. But see, he does say something that I don't know that it's my entire view. It's not my entire view of blockchains, but I do I see his point and his viewpoint on blockchains. He says that blockchain is good for two things only: providing cyber criminals with money and generating hilarity. And so he doesn't believe it's a security trend. I don't know about generating hilarity. I don't know where he's going with that. But providing cyber criminals, it's not so much with money. And I kind of was I was speaking earlier about how, speaking of GD, I can't talk tonight. My allergies are kicking in. Sorry. GDPR can have the negative effect of providing protections for those evildoers that want to register domain names, for example, but their identities are protected by GDPR. And I was like, there's not too many examples where the extreme privacy has caused negative consequences. And then our guest, the CEO of Domain Tools, was like, well, he didn't say it this way, but he was kind of like, well, blockchains and Tor kind of did that thing. And I was kind of like, yeah, that's, and I guess I was thinking of it more in the terms of like, I think of those as anonymization more so than providing you with privacy of your data. But then after like we were talking about it, I'm like, no, that's actually probably all three very similar cases of extreme privacy having consequences that not also negative consequences, right, but enabling the evil bad doers to hide and keep their identity more of a secret or harder to determine who they are. So
to digress briefly,
blockchains and WAFs.
No, Mike Poor shared with us a great tweet today, and it was based along this pretend conversation of, dude, I found this totally awesome GDPR expert. Oh, can you send me his email? No.
Well, so Paul, we mentioned blockchain. I'm sorry, but I've been drinking too much. We mentioned blockchain and we laughed. That's what Anton's talking about.
Yeah. So well, hilarity. Yep. So in that case, he is correct.
But I still go back to what we've been talking about in this segment. What we talked about a lot with Farah in the last segment was, we expect automation to solve a lot of this problem for us, and automation is here to stay. I don't dispute that, but to the degree that automation makes us forget what we're doing or not ever learn it in the first place and not learn sort of the underlying principles of what it is that this tool and that tool does, or what it prevents, what it detects, whatever. I think the whole industry and thus all, the whole business suffers because we forget what we're doing because we very quickly learn to rely on the automation to do it for us, to the point where, and I wanted to stick up for Larry and pen testers that I know, because Farrah said something about, well, a lot of pen testers don't know this stuff and miss it, and I'm thinking, well, the ones that I know do, and they do all that stuff.
That's because you know the actual pen testers.
I know real good pen testers. But I think it's another part of this day of reckoning is either we give up and just give into all the technology and the automation, or we realize that automation never really is going to completely solve the problem for us, and it still goes back to sort of understanding what your goals are. What are you trying to protect? What are you trying to accomplish with this thing that we call security? And how do you do that from a process perspective? Like we were talking about the SDLC, and I got the impression that, people have an SDLC, but they kind of ignore it because they want to get their work done. And even though the SDLC says to do this, they feel like they're good and they can do it quicker. And at least you've got some sort of automation coming in to sort of cover the bases. And if I was picking up correctly on the conversation, there is benefit to running the automated tool earlier in the process to catch things, which makes sense. But there was also the acknowledgement that the automated tool isn't going to catch everything, that there is no substitution, like in pen testing, for an actual body, an actual person, an actual brain doing things manually, trying to apply all the what ifs and scenarios and environmental factors, if you will, into solving the problem of, can I break this thing?
Any closing thoughts on RSA this year?
My closing thoughts are, I think RSA is, representative of the industry that's sort of in transition, in flux, and until the next clear big thing comes along. It doesn't mean that everybody doesn't still go to it. I ran into tons of people that I knew from various, points in my career. So it's a great place to catch up and network. If you can avoid some of the bigger things. But every marketing person I talk to, you can see the look in their eye of, why are we spending all this money? Our customers aren't here. It's just, the vendor hall is mostly filled with vendors. Probably 90% of the people walk in the hall are vendors. So why is everybody there? Just because they have to be, type of thing.
Yeah, that was kind of my feeling too when I attended RSA. Was I did feel that way, Jeff, that the vendor hall was primarily vendors, and I think that the other benefit, a benefit of attending RSA is you have those dinners and special events that aren't in the vendor hall. They're outside the vendor hall. And that's where you get your value. You have a meeting room where you're meeting with potential customers, and you're setting up those meetings ahead of time. Or you're having some kind of party or get-together where the goal isn't necessarily to get new customers. It's maybe we meet the next employee. Maybe we're meeting our next consultant to help us with a project. Maybe we're meeting our next partner that we want to do an integration with. So that was kind of my take.
Well, and it's also the opportunity to share ideas. We all know people that work, when we were in the vendor space, worked for competitors, but you set that all aside because you're all professionals and we're all passionate about certain things. And when you go to those parties, you don't care if you're, to put it in our previous context, we don't care whether you work for Tenable or Qualys or Rapid7. We're all security people trying to solve the same problems. And we talk about those problems and we sort of suspend the irreconcilable differences we have because we work for competing organizations. At some level, we don't care about that. We care about the greater good. We care about this security thing that we do.
And with that, we will take a short break, come back, talk about the security news for this week. Stay tuned. Don't go anywhere.